to some resident experts, and this week is no different. So let's check it out.
Steps 8 and 9 from Alcoholics Anonymous. We made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to all of them. And number 9, we made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Michelle, how did making this list affect you?
I think it right-sized me. I think before I made the list, I thought I had much more impact on way more people than I actually did. And when I made the list was a lot smaller than I thought it would be.
How about that?
Yeah, it was the people closest to me, family, close friends. I didn't have jail time or things, so I didn't have those kind of amends to make. Mine was my family, mainly my family.
You know, and Tim, it strikes me as a potentially discouraging process to think about, good grief, I hurt these people that mean something. How did you keep from getting discouraged in the middle of this process?
Well, I think for the first time in my life, I started acting and not talking so much. My list of people that I need to make amends to are like Michelle, people very, very close to me. And I'd been doing a lot of talking, a lot of, making what promises. I thought was amends were promises and excuses and those sorts of things. So to keep from getting discouraged, I made my list, and then I was intentional about not talking, but changing my actions. And that's the way I approached it. Making amends with my actions first, and earning trust back. They say grace is given, but trust is earned, and I'd broken a lot of trust.
So, gosh, in a spiritual sense, Michelle, I think people in the spiritual transformation spectrum, this is so important. How would you encourage someone who's thinking, would I really do this? How would you give them some encouragement?
Just the results are worth it. The whole of this 12 steps are about getting right-sized, not being the scum under the scum under the scum under the rock, and not being, all that in a bag of chips. So when you have to go to your loved ones, to the people you love most, and to discuss with them the things that you did wrong and how you hurt them, it clears away. It's honesty. It's bringing honesty to the relationship, perhaps for the first time ever.
Well, there's some hope there, and it could be scary, but we're in it together. Unstuck. Keep coming back. Well, good morning again, everyone, and I'm glad that you came back, or if this is your first time, welcome, as we are continuing this series called Unstuck. And if you are just joining us, let me catch you up. The premise is very simple, that stuck happens. We all get stuck from time to time in different areas of our lives. And this series is taking the spiritual truths from the 12-step recovery programs and applying them to our lives so that we can get unstuck. Because we're all in recovery from something, or we should be. I hope we will be by the time we end this series. Now, before we continue on with our steps for today, I wanted to pause and say a word about the Breakthrough series that you just heard about, because it's important for you to understand the why behind the what as we ask you to take a big step together as a whole congregation. Several months ago, sometime last spring, I was made aware of these statistics that were startling to me. That 70 to 80% of the people in our congregation, a congregation like ours, were stuck all in the same place. And it was the area of finances that the statistics said that 70 to 80% of us feel stress and challenge in this one particular area. And you might know, if you've been around for a while, that our mission is to lead people to life-changing faith. Well, life-changing means stuff changes. And so if there's an area where 70 or 80% of us are stuck, we decided we should address that. We should do it together. We should remove the stigma of oh, that's for those people, or that's for them, and say, no, it's for all of us. And so that's why I'm so excited about this opportunity for us to experience a real breakthrough together, all together. And so we're asking everyone who calls Crossroads home to take this step. We're pressing pause on almost every other program starting in January so that we can focus and get unstuck in this area of finances. We've had several hundred leaders already go through this program. Elizabeth and I have gone through it, and it was just created a wonderful dialogue that was missing in our relationship, quite frankly. And our breakthrough will be different than your breakthrough, will be different than your breakthrough, but we're all going to experience it together. So I invite you, starting next week, to sign up, whether it's in your small group or just as a part of one of the groups that we're forming, to experience this together with us. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming. We are talking about breakthroughs of a spiritual nature, how to get unstuck. We said God did not plan for us, did not create us to stay stuck. We've looked at verses like this one from 2 Corinthians, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So God's intention is for us to experience freedom, not bondage, not stuckness. Jesus himself said, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So God didn't design us to be stuck. And what we've done is looked at Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, has taken the spiritual truth from the scriptures and put them into the 12 steps. And we're taking it back out of the steps and applying the spiritual truths to our lives. So I'll give you a quick recap. If you have missed any of these, you can go on our website and listen to the whole message. But week 1 was steps 1, 2, and 3. And they were, I can't, but God can, and I'm going to let him. It was a step of surrender that we decided to open up our hands and allow God to do what we can't do for ourselves. And then in week 2, we talked about taking a searching and fearless moral inventory, like getting serious about the stuff in our lives that needs to change. And we said the problem with that is that usually we're neither searching nor fearless when it comes to our introspective selves. But that's what it requires in order to actually have transformation take place. Now, I have to say, I don't know how many of you are actually doing that, but I am, and I want to tell you that it took me 9 days just to finish the first section on the resentments, and I figured that would be the easiest one, because I thought I don't really resent anybody. Oh, my word. As I began to actually just investigate, don't worry, you're not on the list. Well, some of you are, but anyway, it was really quite impactful in my life. So if you're still working that list, you're with me. And I'm going to work it all the way through because that's what it requires in order for me to understand what God is changing in my life. And then last week, if you were here, we talked about being entirely ready for God to change us. Entirely ready meant that, I'll explain it this way. I have a refrigerator that we bought within the last year, and it has one of those fancy in-the-door water and ice things. Maybe that's not fancy. It was fancy to us because our last one didn't have one. But so, and it also has this little light that tells you when you need to replace the water filter, right? So it says order filter, and then if you don't do anything, it has a red light, and it every time you push the thing, it says replace the water filter, replace the water filter. Well, I did that once, and then in my replacing it, I figured out that it actually doesn't know whether you replaced it or not. You just press the button that says reset, and the little red light stops blinking. Why am I telling you that story? Because this is what some of us do. We hear the truth and we go, oh, but we don't change anything. It's like we just have figured out a workaround that makes the red light stop blinking, but actually nothing has changed in our lives. So last week, we talked about these steps 6 and 7, that were, I am entirely ready for things to change. It reminded me of something I read one time from Dallas Willard, who said this, that the number one reason that people don't change spiritually is because they never intend to. That they never actually intend for something to actually change. And so we learned last week that God has a role in that, and we can't play his role. And you can't do it without him. But you have a role, and I have a role, and God won't do our role. But when those two things come together in that step of being entirely ready, intending to change, and humbly asking for God to remove these defects, that's when the power gets released. Okay, so up to speed. We're going to look at steps 8 and 9 today, which you've already heard, but summarized this way. Make a list of people that you need to make amends with. Be willing to do it, and then go do it. Make amends. Heal hurting relationships. Right wronged relationships. And this might be the most challenging of the steps, these two steps, because of a couple of things. Challenging because of the content. I just have to come face to face with the stuff that I've done that I wish I didn't, that has hurt other people. That's hard, just to be honest with yourself. But the second reason that it may be the most challenging is the context. So it's not only the content of these steps, it's the context in which some of us have grown up. That the context that we're used to thinking about, especially in church, encourages us to ignore these steps. And I'll explain that as we go along. But the truth is that if you've been in church for a long time, or if you have been around faith for most of your life, these steps might be harder for people like me and you than it is for somebody who's just new at this. And so the longer you've been around, the more apt you are to ignore these steps. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So that's good news. For some of you who are just investigating faith, or you're just checking this Christianity thing out, these steps might come more naturally to you. They might be easier for you to comprehend. They won't be easier for you to execute, because they're pretty challenging for all of us when we decide we're going to right some wrong relationships before we move on in any type of transformation with God. So this truth that we're learning about today is taught over and over again in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, and especially by Jesus. And we're going to get there in just a minute. But before we look at this truth from the Scripture, I want to describe it in my life. I want to give you my story of how this truth has come to play in my own life. Some of you know this. I grew up here in Westminster, and I went to the Westminster United Methodist Church growing up. And that was the foundation of my faith. I'm so thankful for the people there and the way that they served me and my family. And that served as sort of the foundation of my faith. I went to Westminster High School, and it was there that through some relationships and through the ministry of Young Life that some of you have heard me talk about, I began a relationship with Jesus. And that was a game changer for me. Changed everything. You've heard me talk about that, some of you. But the question that I continued to ask and try to answer that spanned that whole gap and that I carried for a long, long time was this question. What does God want? I mean, not to get me into heaven, because I understood when I was in high school that was based on what Jesus did, not on what I do. And my faith in him was what determined my eternal destiny. And so it wasn't that. It was this question about how do I please God? How can I stay close to him? That's a good question initially. But the longer that I held on to that question, the less good it got. And in fact, the more distracting it got from what was really important, and I don't think I'm alone. So, in other words, to answer this question, what is God really interested in? What does God want from me on a daily basis? My opinion of what are the requirements that matter to him has actually changed over time. Can you see how that would happen? In other words, in different seasons of my life, I have different opinions about what I think matters to God more and less. For example, it made clear to me that don't drink and don't have sex were really high on the list, right? You probably remember those days. Some of you are in those days, right now. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's the way I answered the question at that season of my life. Now, I don't answer that question in this season of my life that way anymore. I'm a married man, and there's problems if, you get the idea, right? On the other way, but the point is, not any of that, the point is that answering that question has changed over time. And what I learned is, depending on who you ask, they'll give you a different opinion about what the answer is to what does God want, what is important to him. There's a Catholic answer, right? Some of you know that one really well, Catholic school and the nuns and all of that. There's a Protestant answer. There's an evangelical answer. There's a conservative answer. There's a liberal answer. There's a Muslim answer. Right? And so the longer that I was at this faith thing, the more confusing that question became. And I don't think I'm the only one. The fact that so many different answers come from so many different places makes it apparent to me that there's a lot of us asking that question and confused about the answer. And so this is evidence that might be important to you. And I get asked these questions all the time. Is this a sin? Is this a sin? And whenever someone asks me that question, or is it okay if, or will God be really upset if I don't? What we're asking is, what are the requirements? What are the rules? And that question, again, is helpful initially, but the longer that you hold on to it, the more unhelpful it becomes. Because, don't you know this? As soon as I give you the rule, what will you do? You'll figure out an exception. You know you will. You're great at it. Great, right? Because you'll say, well, what about in every situation? What about this? Right? And so every time, this is just the way we work. Most of us anyway. I won't lump you. I don't know you, but I know me. And I think we're a little bit alike. That every time somebody gives me a rule, what I'll do is I'll figure out an exception to the rule. I'll give you a famous example. Maybe one of the most requoted statements I've ever made in my life is this. Always lie to the Nazis, right? And we had a very little church when I first said this, but people come back and they repeat it to me. And the point was this. Does the Bible say don't lie? Yeah, absolutely. It's not a trick question. Yes, it does. That's probably one of the 10 commandments that you could name. You probably can't name most of them. But it does say don't lie. But as soon as you get that rule, people will go, well, in every circumstance? And the truth is no, actually. Not in every circumstance. Why? Because if I describe to you harboring some Jewish fugitives running from the Nazis in World War II, and they were hidden in your basement, and the Nazi guy stops and says, do you have any Jews here? Do you know what you do? You lie. You lie to the Nazis. Always lie to the Nazis. That's the point, right? That's not the point of this story. The point is, as soon as I give you a rule, you and I are great at figuring out the exception to the rule. And basically, what we end up doing is trying to figure out how to work the vertical system. Right, the vertical system. How do I make sure that God and I are okay? And it boils down to this. I would really like, we're going to get to the truth, I promise, I didn't forget. This is the end of my story. It boils down to this. I would really like to do whatever I would really like to do. But I would like to also make sure that I'm not doing something that will cause God to be mad at me. I don't want God to let harm happen to me or my family. I don't want to lose my job because of this choice that I made. So I want to know, where does this line fall? How can I manage the vertical system? All right, end of my story. Enter Jesus, who spoke into a culture. This has happened for thousands of years in most world religions, that figuring out how to work the vertical system. And so Jesus enters and speaks in many different places right into this question. I'm going to share one with you this morning. It's from Matthew chapter 5, which is where the Sermon on the Mount is included. Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, written about an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus. And this section, these 3 chapters, are often talked about as the Sermon on the Mount. It's the most prevalent teaching section of Jesus, probably stuff that he taught over and over again, not just at one time. And so in that setting, I want to read to you just 2 verses from Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 23. Let's listen. Therefore, this is Jesus talking, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you. Okay, stop. Got the picture? It says, imagine that you are at the altar. That would have been the altar at the temple where you come to offer sacrifice to God. That is a very vertical relationship endeavor, right? I'm going to do this religious ritual in order to, it could be a great thing. It could be a worshipful thing. It could remind my heart of my dependence upon God. It could do all sorts of things. And it was commanded by God to do, and so it's not a bad thing. I don't want you to read it in that way at all. But Jesus says, okay, imagine that you're doing this thing. You're at the temple, at the altar, doing your religious thing, and then you remember that somebody has an issue with you, that somebody, there's a relationship that's not right. And notice here, just by the way, that you're okay. You don't have a problem with them. They just have a problem with you. And by the way, this is a can't lose, no win situation. Because in other places in the Gospel of Matthew itself, it says, if you have a problem with somebody else, you should go to them. And then here it says, if they have a problem with you, you should go to them. So either way, you got to go. And that's the point of this step, right? Is you have to go and make amends. So Jesus is saying, imagine you're doing this vertical thing commanded by God, and you remember, there's this relationship that's broken. What should you do? Now, this is actually a question, a debate that the rabbis would have in the first century. Maybe earlier than that, I don't know. But they would answer this question. So if you are engaged and you've started one duty, when should you stop that and go start another duty? What's the decision-making process there? And this was their answer that they agreed upon. If the duty that you have remembered is a higher priority, is more important than the one that you started, you stop this one and you go to that one. You get that, right? That would be, let's put that in our context. If you are checking your email, and that's a good thing, especially if you want to have a work relationship and other relationships, you're checking your email, that's a good thing. And you remembered, I was supposed to pick up my kid, and they were getting dropped off in front of, the high school, and it's Sunday afternoon, and it's closed, and it's cold, and I forgot. Now, just take a flyer on this one. What should you do? And this is not some of you, I'm a little worried that this is not coming so quickly to you, right? You stop the email and you go pick up the kid. Why? Because this duty is more important than this one. Watch what Jesus says. So the scenario he sets up is you're doing this worship thing, this vertical relationship thing with God that he commanded you to do. And you remember that there's a person, you're okay, but they're not okay. There's a broken relationship. What do? Verse 24. This is what Jesus says. Leave your gift. Leave it there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. What's he saying? He's saying, look, you got to stop this. This is more important. This is a higher priority. This vertical religious activity compared to this horizontal relational activity, this one trumps that one. And at some point, listen. At some point in the transformational process, the process gets lived out in the horizontal relationships in your lives. And sometimes that is to the interruption of the vertical relationship, the vertical experience that you have placed so much emphasis on. That's why it's harder for those of us who have grown up going to church, grown up in a faith tradition. The story here is God will be okay. You will not be okay if you don't go make this okay. And so God says, yeah, that's the priority here. So here's the truth, right, that we can distill out of this. If you want the power of God to be released in your life for the transformation of you beyond what you are capable of doing on your own, if you want that, then you must make relationships right. You must not avoid the horizontal relationships. In fact, you may need to interrupt all your focus on the vertical relationship to go make some of these right. That's steps 8 and 9. That's go make amends. And so I just want to make 3 comments on this truth. And then we'll end here. And we'll ask you to go do it. We'll ask you to actually incorporate these in our lives. So here's my 3 comments. I'll tell them to you, then I'll explain. Most of us understand this truth. You'll see when I explain that. Some of us have experienced the negative implications of when people don't get this right. And a few of us, very few, actually take this seriously. All right, so let me just make those comments. First, most of us understand this truth. I'll prove it to you. What's the easiest way to get on my good side? Do something for me. You could do that. Money, unmarked bills, that would be fine. But you know what's better than that? Do something for my kids. If you do something for my kids, if you compliment or support or encourage or rescue or help my kids, easiest way to get on my good side. All right, now you're all going to get this one right. What's the easiest way to get on my bad side? Do something to my kids. Now, I'm not thrilled if you hurt me, but what's way worse, is if you hurt one of my kids, if you are unfair, if you're disrespectful, if you damage one of my kids. Now, in my real life, in my real kids' lives, that hadn't happened a whole lot. Every now and then, there was that clueless teacher who didn't get my kid, and all the teachers in the room are like, oh, you're one of those clueless parents who thinks nobody gets your kid. I get it. Or there's a coach, and they didn't play my kid when clearly, in my unbiased opinion, my kid was way more talented, than the kids that they were choosing to play. But here's the truth. If you mistreat my kids, don't try to suck up to me. Don't try to do anything to please me until you go and make that right. Why? Because they're my kids. And when you mistreat them, I don't care what you do to me. You need to make that right before we're even going to have a conversation. So, God says, if you're here focused on me and you remember this isn't right with this person over here, he says, stop. Why? Because they're his kids. So you understand this truth. You do. And you understand why it works. There's a power. This is steps 8 and 9. When you do this, there is a power that gets released if you will do it, and a cost that is paid if you don't. Now, this leads me to the second comment. All of us, most of us, understand the truth. Some of us have experienced the negative side of people who didn't get this right? And this is more negative than positive. It goes both ways. But this is where, so if you're not a Christian and you're here this morning, if you are somebody who is checking out church, if you have a friend who, as often as you invite them, they're not coming, often the reason is because they have met too many Christians who didn't get this right. And that's the reason. In other words, so many people have been mistreated by someone or someone's. The church is not actually a thing. It's a bunch of people. And so many people have been mistreated by someone. Maybe it was not you. Maybe it was your mother or your family, or maybe it was you. And our stories are all specifically different, but with the same central theme. And it goes something like this. Someone mistreated them who claimed to know Jesus, or you, and then they went off and they sang Happy Jesus songs. And you went, what? How can you do that? How can you go and be so happy about Jesus after you were so rude to my dad? How does that work? How can you do that and say all this about the love of Jesus when you didn't love me at all? In fact, you didn't even listen to me. You made up your mind before we even had the conversation. How can that be? And some of you are nodding your heads because I know that you've seen it. Some of you are here and you're just like, I'm going to give it one more shot. And this is why. Because people get this wrong all the time. And many of us have experienced the negative implications of people missing this truth. Not only is missing this unattractive, it's also ineffective, right? In other words, it not only misses the point, it misses the power. And by the way, it's actually the opposite of what Jesus taught. So we'll get back to that. But it's why we can't skip these steps. Like you could say, okay, I'm good. I'm going to release it to God. And I'm going to ask God to change me. And then I'm going to do this other God. And there's people that you're just ignoring. And you're like, I don't think that's all that important. I'm just going to keep the focus on me and God. You can't skip this step. These steps release power. You miss the point and you miss the power if you miss this step. All right, last comment. A few of us, very few of us, take this seriously on a regular basis. And it's not because it's not clear, right? It couldn't be more clear. Jesus himself in John chapter 15 says multiple times, this is my command. Your one command, Jesus? There's like 600 of them in the Old Testament. This is my command, says it over and over. Love one another. This is what I want for you to do. Well, okay, what? Love one another. At one point he says, it's all summed up in this. Love one another. All people will know you are my disciples, it says, if you love one another. It can't be more clear. And the Apostle Paul, after Jesus' death and resurrection, he has this amazing sentence in this letter to these churches in Galatia. And he says this, it starts this way. The only thing that counts. Have you seen how thick the Bible is? You can tell me, the only thing that counts? Yep, here it is. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. It can't be more clear. So why don't we take it seriously? It is clear and simple, but it is so blasted hard. It's hard. That's why I said these steps are challenging because of the content and the context. Because look, you can hide in the vertical, can't you? When you're thinking about just you and God, you can hide behind some verses and you can Old Testament thing and you can say, well, how about David and what he did? And what about Solomon? He has 700 wives. And you can, in that vertical relationship, you can hide. You know where you can't hide? The people right around you with answering this question. How do I love them? That's hard to hide from. It's not easy to do, but it's hard to hide from. What does love require of me is usually very clear, but very demanding. And so I ignore it often. For me, the beliefs in my vertical system evolve over time. I told you that before. And so what I believe about what God requires, we can have a rousing debate about Calvinism and Arminianism and millennialism and pre and post and and pro. And my friend said he's pro-millennial. He's all for it, wants to be there when it happens. And if you laughed about that, that's probably a sign that you need to hear this. I can have a great debate about all of that, and none of it changes how I'm supposed to love the person that's right in front of me. That's so clear and so demanding, which is why I think we avoid it. We can't hide from this truth. We can't skip this step. So these are such important steps to make a list. If you did the fourth and fifth step, you'll have a list of people that you've harmed. Be willing to make amends, and then go do it. Don't let anything stand in the way of you going and doing it. With these two clarifications, let me at least say these two things. One, this is not for you to be reconciled with someone who's unsafe. This is not a command for you to go reestablish an unsafe or an abusive, a dangerous relationship. Not at all. Nor is it a command for you to take a step when it would hurt the other person. And you just get to check your box, and it doesn't matter. It'll crush them, but if it's going to potentially put you in danger or it's going to hurt someone else, then all bets are off. We have more work to do in figuring that out. But minus those two situations, the truth is, if you want God's power to be released in a transforming way in your life, you got to go do this. So you go do it. You can't be right with the Father if you're not right with one of his kids. So go make it right. And this truth, some of us have experienced this. And can I say, if you or someone you know was mistreated by someone, don't let that someone keep you from the real someone. Because Jesus taught exactly the opposite of what you've experienced. Don't let them keep you from him. And then finally, this truth, often we don't take seriously on a regular basis. Do you know how I know? Because no one got up and left after I got done reading that scripture. Come on, no one in the room has a relationship that's not right. If we took it seriously, wonder what would happen if we just said, oh, I'm out. Okay, I need to go. I bet that happened when Jesus was giving this talk. He's giving this talk in the temple, and some people just were like, well, that's me. I'm going to go. Why? Because the power gets released in the obedient step of making amends. So we're not going to sing any more songs this morning. We're not going to do any more programming. We're just going to pray and go do. And so I'm going to hand it over to our campus pastors so they can lead us in a closing prayer.
Church, will you stand with me? Let's pray. Lord God, your word challenges us. It's not easy, and yet when we live it out, there's this freedom that comes in our lives when we do that. And so, Lord, every person in this room probably has someone that we could say, you know what, we need to leave right now and we need to go and make this right. There's probably moments in all of our lives that we think about situations and people that we've wronged and things that we know that we should make right, and we just kind of push it down and we kind of hit the reset button and we hope that it goes away. And yet, Lord, we know that that's not what your word says. Your word says to go and to make amends, immediately to go make amends with the people in our lives that we know that we've hurt or that we've wronged. And as we do that, we're going to find ourselves free. We're going to find ourselves unstuck. And so, Lord, I just pray you give us courage to live this out, even when it's hard, and find freedom on the other side. In Jesus' name, amen. That's all I got. We got to go do this. Let's go. Love you guys.